Starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi everyone, welcome to another one of our webinar series. So today we are talking about CRMs WTF. So my name's Carly, I'm from Community Legal Centres Queensland, and I'll soon introduce Daniel Stone from Principal Co. Before we get started, I will go through our usual welcome. So I'd like to first acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are holding this webinar today. So in Brisbane, they are the Turrbal and Yagara people. I wish to pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and acknowledge the important role Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders continue to play in our society. As this webinar is being viewed by people across Queensland and Australia, I'd also like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land throughout the country and acknowledge there is still a lot of work to be done in terms of achieving reconciliation. So, I should have done this first actually. I'll just double check everyone can hear. So if you can press the button on your control panel that looks like a hand, we'll know that you can hear everything that we're saying, hopefully. And yep, okay, great. So we've got some hands going up all over the place. That's fantastic. So I'm just going to lower all your hands and ask a second question. Daniel's going to be presenting via the webcam today. So can you please put up your hand if you can see Daniel's webcam, if you can see Daniel on the screen? Oh, that's wonderful. Okay, wonderful. That's great. Thank you so much. Okay, so Daniel's going to be chatting to us today about how CRMs can help community legal centres to consolidate constituent information together with donor or participation history into a valuable resource that we can use to improve the quality and impact of our work. So Daniel's going to be taking questions throughout the presentation today, so I will go through how to ask questions. So there are two ways that you can ask questions. So the first one is to use the button that looks like a hand again that you pressed before. We'll see a hand go up on our end and we can then unmute you and you can ask your question via your microphone. Alternatively, you can type your question into the question box on the control panel and then Daniel will see your questions come through and he'll read them out and respond to them during his presentation. So we'll also be making a recording of today's webinar. So for anyone who wasn't able to attend or if you want to share with others in your centre, you can do that and we'll send out the link this afternoon once it's up on the website. So I might now hand over to Daniel to take it from here. Thanks, Daniel.
Sounds great. Thank you. So I guess just to start, one thing that I'd love to hear is, and if you're able to kind of pop some responses in the chat, how much do people know about CRMs? Is this something that you've never heard of before? Is this something you've kind of introduced early on in your centres but may not have fully realised? Is it something that you use a lot and you're curious about how to evolve that? So either expressions that would be really useful is either little comments, so we do this, we do that, or we're interested in this or that, or if you don't have any specific questions, just a kind of number out of 10, with 10 being you're an expert and 0 being nothing, just so I can get a sense about where people are at and the kind of thoughts and questions you all have, because I know there's a lot of different experiences across the room. So yeah, if you can pop that in the chat just while I move on to the next little bit, and then I'll return to them in a couple of minutes. But I guess just to kind of start is to tell you a little bit more about myself and Principal and what we do and how this all kind of fits together. So we're a kind of what I call us a campaigning agency, which essentially means that we do a lot of digital infrastructure and creative around progressive campaigns, political campaigns often, but also do lots and lots of work with NGOs about membership and broad kind of constituent engagement as well. So at the moment, for example, we're running all of the digital outreach work for the equality campaign, which is a big, exciting task, as well as having done lots of work with elections beforehand. We do most of GetUp's TVCs and things like that. So a big spread of work from our side of things. The way that CRMs pop up in our work is that we do lots of organizational websites, which are a bit more dour and less exciting, but then also the kind of campaigns or outreach or membership work that I just touched on that you kind of use those digital infrastructure pieces for. And that kind of plays out in a few different ways, in that often people will try to be fundraising, so building their revenue base through their digital properties, or they'll be trying to kind of reach out and build support in the community around whatever issue it is that they might be kind of hoping to advocate on, or just improve their awareness in the community in the case of, people who are a bit more topical or consumer interest facing, or through to trying to get people to vote a certain way or do a certain thing in a much more hard political context. So that's a kind of bit about us. And I specifically do a lot of our kind of strategy and planning work in that process. Although we've got a couple of developers and designers here who do a lot of the kind of other stuff altogether. So that's me. I'm not seeing anything in the chat, and I'm not sure if that's because, oh, here you go. I've just seen questions. I looking in the wrong spot. So very little knowledge, 0, 0, and we increasingly use CRM, but don't know much about them. Anne, would you be able to possibly contribute to that as why do you think you might need a CRM? What is the useful, what do you think you might be able to benefit from having one? I'll keep going just while you're responding so that we don't hold each other up too much. But for everybody else, I think I'll start then with a bit of an overview as to what it is and why they're kind of useful. So CRM stands for either a customer relationship management system, or I find that a bit inappropriate for most of our clients. So instead, I prefer to refer to them as constituent relationship management systems. And essentially, at their most simple, what they do is they keep records on who gets in touch with you and who they are and what they wanted. So any CRM will include that person's name, their date of birth, their email and phone number, kind of stuff like that. It's also pretty common for them to include other kind of demographic details about them too. So if it's appropriate for your organization, their faith affiliation, or their marital status, or level of schooling, or whatever else that might be. That information then is, once it's kind of collected, is then applied in a couple of different ways. And again, it really comes down to the purpose of your organization as to how it's made useful. So, and there's kind of really two distinct types of CRM, which I'll kind of explore a bit more as we go on. But to kind of explain ways that they're useful, it's worth thinking about in those kind of two real modes. One is really around membership or kind of client management. So that's a much more internal style of CRM. So, for example, that being one that I think is probably very commonly useful for many CLCs, in that you're able to keep track of people you've worked with, their matters, their concerns, and include a bit more elaborate qualitative information as well. So the nature of the issue that they're facing, steps taken so far, challenges faced so far, things like that, so that you're able to keep track of it over time yourself. Your colleagues are able to keep track of it if there's change, or if if a person picks the matter up, or if somebody might leave or come, or all that sort of stuff. But also importantly, it helps us track people over time. And I think this is one thing where some of the organizations we've worked with that are similar to CLCs have really found value is, if being able to discover, this particular person is having this issue pretty concurrently, or pretty recurrently, as they've had the same problem a few times over the last 5 or 6 years, or if we're seeing trends across certain types of people. So CRMs will often, depending on the way you set them up, will let you be able to say, oh wow, we've noticed that there's been a real increase in a certain sort of issue or incident happening with women between the ages of 18 to 35 who happen to live in metro areas. That's odd. I wonder what's driving that. So just seeing in the chat. So that's a really, really good point about doubling up about us. And I just saw Anne's comment as well. So you've got multiple large Excel spreadsheets for our various contacts, donors, and stakeholders. It's very hard to manage, keep up to date, and there's a lot of double up. Right? I'll speak to Anne's point, which kind of fits into what I was just saying, and then come back to the point about multiple databases. So yeah, as I was saying, there's kind of two real types. There's one, which is one I was just expanding on, which is the operational, or kind of the internal, very genuine and real and direct relationship management side of things, of which it's fairly easy and straightforward. And it sounds like, and that's definitely the kind of ballpark that's useful for you. And the reason that a CRM is more useful than something like a spreadsheet or something like that is you're able to do that cross-referencing, and you're able to keep track of who's entering which data when, and who did what action when, and to do that kind of more analytical stuff I described, such as seeing certain trends of behavior happening in certain groups over time. So yeah, really, and not let alone just security and stability, which is, I think, really, really important when you're including that kind of like either mission critical information for the organization or personally sensitive information as well. So and to also give context, the second type is something which is a bit more like advocacy based, so it's more external outreach. I think that's something that CLCs probably haven't done as much in my knowledge, and there's less of a kind of established experience or understanding of. But I think something that I know that particularly the Victorian Federation of is doing a lot of work on, which is trying to expand the public outreach and awareness through CRMs. So that's kind of different in the sense that you're picking up smaller amounts of information of a lot more people, with the goal of kind of doing mass email outs, doing small donor conversions, and kind of building a community of people who support and value your work, rather than necessarily the people who might immediately be engaging with you for support, or be somebody who's a very close ally to the organization and is known to you personally, if that distinction makes sense. But before I move on to the advocacy stuff, I'm going to focus a bit more on the organizational component of that, because I think that's really where a lot of your thinking is probably sitting at the moment. And to the point about class, that's a really interesting one. I don't know much about that system in particular, but having multiple CRMs is a frequent kind of challenge. I think pretty much every organization that we work with ends up in that situation, whether that's being having a membership CRM, a fundraising CRM, and then an advocacy CRM, and they've kind of evolved through multiple different paths. So like a marketing and communications team might have needed one, a kind of service delivery project team might have needed one, and the admin team or fundraising team may have been using another, and just over time everyone's kind of gotten stuck in their groove. So it's not a surprise that that's the case. But I think you're absolutely right that finding a way to make sure that there's not double up in process, and that everyone's actually getting the benefit out of it is really important, and also making sure that everything's up to date. That's a question that I think would require us to sit down and look at each of those endpoints and the bits of data that you need to use, and to find a way of integrating them. But so I wish I could give a simple answer on that one, other than it's definitely doable. But just like I guess connecting a new TV in your lounge room, it's something you do every now and again, and you need to kind of sit down and look at all the ports you have and find the ones that all line up with each other to make it work. But really important to do. So I think the next thing I might kind of do is, actually, before I kind of talk about different systems and stuff that exist and their benefit or otherwise, I thought I might spend a little bit more time just kind of reflecting on bits of value. And so I guess, like if people wouldn't mind, throwing into the chat, do some of the things I just said sound like that would be useful? Do you think it wouldn't be useful? Is it particularly helpful? Do you see any kind of challenges or issues or kind of snag points that might sit around doing something like this in your organizations? And what's kind of stopped you being able to do something like this beforehand? Is there a kind of an institutional internal challenge? And what does that look like? Obviously, you don't have to answer every single one of those questions, but if one of those, if you're having thoughts that relate to one of those, I'd really love to hear them. I might just leave a moment for you all to respond before I move on to another concept. Yeah, cost is a good question. Also on that, I'd be interested to know how many records you imagine that you might have in a system like this as well. You know, would you have details on 500 people, on 2,000 people, on 10,000 people? Like what kind of or more? What kind of benchmark are we talking here as well? Because that'll have a big factor on pricing. Yeah, and privacy, whose uses information? That's a really good point. And probably around 1,000 to 1,500. Yeah, that's great. Cool. Yeah, okay. So generally around the hundreds to thousands, which is great. So on a cost perspective, pretty much there's not really a system you'd be using that's going to cost a particularly large sum of money at that kind of rate. So that should be hunky dory. Although each one has their kind of own pricing, I think. Yeah, like you'd probably be looking between the $2,000 to $20,000 mark, I guess, at a really broad spread, depending on what kind of product you used. Which hopefully you'd be able to see benefits in both productivity or the fundraising capacity off the back of. To Sue's point about privacy, that's a really good question. And I think that security and privacy are really, really important with anything like this. And that's even more so the case in the context of people who are engaging in the kind of complicated and nuanced things that CLCs often represent people on behalf of, and the level of intimate details that you'd be collecting in this process. So almost everything, in fact, I think everything that I'd be suggesting that you might look at, indeed, the majority of the market is really anchored around the idea of cloud hosting. So all of these things are software as services now, which means that they're hosted on a kind of secure server in the same way that your Gmail or Facebook might be as well. But unlike those services, all of these products place a real premium on privacy as far as we're aware, and that's something that matters a lot for a lot of our clients as well, where there's quite politically sensitive or personally sensitive information as well. Each one has different levels of privacy, but generally that exists in terms of the actual physical location where the information is stored is secure. It means access to that server is usually highly secure through a range of ways, whether that's by making sure that it's HTTPS and there's security certificates for the site that you're accessing, through to fairly nuanced ability to control user access, so user accounts and profiles. And indeed, that's, I think, one of the most important benefits for organizations like CLCs or any kind of small NGO over the kind of more traditional spreadsheet model. And I think, that this on its own is worth the cost, in that you can set up each person within the organization with their own login and password. You can set that person's level of access and level of control. And it means that there's never a situation where the data, in the sense of like an Excel file or something, is taken anywhere, because it's not something you take. It's also not something that people can export or keep a copy of when they might leave. It's not something that people can put on a USB and then forget on a train. It makes sure that there's a really, really accountable framework around how this stuff is used. It means that if someone was to move on, in hopefully not, but in acrimonious circumstance or something, you can immediately manage their access to that kind of information and scale it down or remove it. If you need to do Chinese walls for some reason, you can facilitate that. it gives you a lot more control over who does or doesn't see things and how that operates. And I think that's a really, really important driver for most people. Hopefully that kind of answers your question around privacy. Yeah, it sounds like that's kind of it on principle, but please, if anyone has any broader thoughts, please let me know, because I am going to jump on to some of the more nuanced things that you might be looking at. And I know that can be a bit more specific and in the weeds. So if people have broader questions, like please put them to me. So I think, as I said, there's really like two big kind of categories of CRM that you might want to look at. One is that much more like intimate user kind of experience. So clients who you're working with, or people you have a direct personal relationship with, or the broader mass broadcast kind of CRM where you're picking up large swathes of the population, but you may not actually be, or rather large swathes of the population are engaging with you, but you may not actually ever get to have a face-to-face or a phone conversation with them. It's kind of happening at scale, in much more of that kind of, GetUp or Apple computer model or something like that. So on the more intimate side of things, and it's interesting to say that that all tools that fall into either one of those two categories are actually capable of doing both things. So a tool that's ostensibly made for advocacy can actually provide you the more traditional straight CRM work, and a traditional straight CRM can provide some of the more outgoing broadcast and advocacy tools as well. It's really just a matter of like what kind of side did they lean on, what was their heritage and what problem were they originally designed to solve. Both kind of categories can do both, but they'll do one style of engagement better than the other. So on that first style, things you might be looking at are things like Razor's Edge or Salesforce. Salesforce is probably the best thing that you'd be looking for, in that it's kind of a bit more scalable. Razor's Edge is really dedicated to fundraising and built for NGO fundraising. So like if you're looking at doing fairly large scale fundraising outreach, or if your organization is really dependent on kind of small to medium donor contributions for your revenue, then that might be the pathway for you to go. Whereas Salesforce is a bit more of a generalist tool, and something you can kind of buy into at a bit of a lower price point. But with that comes a huge amount of scale. So both of those tools are kind of made by extremely large companies, and I think that's actually important to note as well. There's there's quite a lot of smaller CRMs out there that are kind of made as kind of custom solutions to different problems. They're often interesting, but the question I always ask is there enough resources inside the organization for them to respond if there's a problem? Are there enough resources in the organization to continue development and to build and introduce new things as things evolve? And that's been a huge challenge for some of our larger heritage organizations. So you're looking at people like Greenpeace or some of the larger unions who have had membership systems since the 80s. They find it really difficult to iterate and improve, because the systems they move on to just aren't being maintained or evolved. Which is also, as a side, another real big benefit of having everything hosted in the cloud, is that just like Facebook and Gmail and stuff like that, updates just kind of happen automatically. You don't need to put aside time once every 3 years to go through and replace everything and find out all the things that are broken in the process and repair it. What was my original train of thought there? So like the good thing about Razor's Edge and Salesforce both, and in fact, I think the majority of things that I'm going to talk about today I kind of reached that sweet spot of having a lot of scale. So there's a lot of people working on it who can both help you if you're having technical issues, security issues, and also ensure that the tool's constantly being evolved and used and up to date. Because I think that the horror stories of people buying into a platform and then kind of being stuck and not being able to move forward are many and frequent. And I guess one fundamental principle just on that I would kind of hope to leave you with is always look for something that has an API. An API is I can't remember myself, actually, application programmer interface, I think it is. Essentially, it's just like a little pipe. So you can plug one system into another. So that really, really speaks to the point that was made in the chat earlier about making sure that you can connect things up. And if anything you're moving on to has an API, it means that you'll be able to confidently either plug it into another system that you might have and make sure that the two speak to each other, or it means you can kind of add additional functionality on that original system may not have. So, let's say that it might seem extremely foreign and unlikely now, and it may never happen, but that in 5 years' time, your CLC decides to set up a call center, and what it needs to be able to do is to pipe some of those CRM responses into a call center system or software, and then have the responses you're getting from those calls put back into the CRM. An API permits that kind of flexibility to happen. You don't need to have that functionality built in when you start, but it means that you can later if you need to for some reason. So I just noticed there's been a few comments, so I might just pause for a second to flick through them. Yeah, so you mentioned there's Salesforce has a volunteer app plugin and is available for free on application for not-for-profits. I believe it's free for a license of 10 or less. Yeah, absolutely. And that's the other kind of benefit of some of these larger orgs is that, their footprint is large enough that they can kind of do favors for smaller not-for-profits as well. Yeah, and I think that that's kind of an interesting tension too, where people like Razor's Edge, for example, focus almost exclusively on not-for-profits and aren't able to offer that. But what they do bring to the table is a much deeper sector awareness and experience. They really understand how not-for-profits function, and can be really helpful in guiding that process, understanding some of the internal cultural and even kind of client / end user challenges you might be facing. Whereas, Salesforce doesn't have that skill, but what they do have is the capacity to kind of do larger scale favors for you. So there's a trigger thought there that I wanted to come back to, which was, basically, I think we kind of always look for people who have a bit of scale, and hopefully it kind of makes sense as to what I'm thinking of there. And indeed, when I say we, I mean both on behalf of clients and even Principal ourselves as a fairly small organization have trialed some kind of smaller versions of these tools that friends or other people within the Australian progressive community have built, or other people within the international community have built that only have 2 or 3 people working on them, and they're great, and I really am. We really have tried to be supportive of that stuff, but we've generally just found over time that a tool that's brilliant today still needs to be brilliant in 3 years, and those smaller teams usually just aren't able to ensure that the same level of quality product and quality service remains. So they're kind of basic things to look out for is kind of scale and constant evolution and development, as well as an API, which I think is really important. And on the API, the other thing that I would say is keep an eye out for what standard it meets. So, for example, RESTful, that's capital REST, lowercase FUL, is kind of like a standard in the same way that like AC electricity, I guess, is, or something like that we might encounter in the rest of our lives. And it just means that you kind of know exactly what it is you're getting. There's one product that's primarily pitched to unions who came across who asserted that they had an API, and then it was revealed that it was kind of like a Bush law equivalent of, and it was like, that's not what we understood that to mean. So I think that's just another thing to think about, is like APIs aren't all the same, and so just kind of exploring what that is. But that being said, as long as you've got something like that, it means that you don't need to put too much pressure on any decision you make in the short term. Like, you should absolutely be thorough, but you can also feel confident to know that if you're not going to be backed into a corner, you know, like you should always make the best decision you can at a time, but an API means that there's flexibility in the future as you discover more, as your situation might change. Great. Did anyone have any questions on anything that I just kind of ran over? I know there's a few kind of big ideas in there. So I'll take another quick pause to see if you want to pose some questions or throw anything in the chat. Right, I'll keep moving in about a minute. I'll leave a little bit of time in case anyone has anything to say or any questions or anything they'd like me to explore. Okay. So I guess, yeah, so there's really Razor's Edge and Salesforce that kind of fit in as the big dominant revenue or constituent management side of things. There may be some legal CRMs that we haven't come across in our work that might be appropriate for some of the project stuff that you guys are working on, which, you know, if you'd like my opinion of them, if you send them through, I'm happy to have a bit of a look at them. But yeah, hopefully those principles I just outlined are helpful for assessing or reviewing anything you might be looking at. So again, like if there's a small scale CRM that's kind of been built by, you know, a couple of people who are ex-lawyers, but they don't have a lot of resources behind them, I'd be pretty skeptical about that, even if it seems perfectly fit for process, just because in a couple of years it may not be. Cool. So I think moving on from that, there's the second type, which, as I said, is much more around public outreach and scale, I suppose, of which Razor's Edge and Salesforce are capable of. And indeed, these tools are capable of doing a lot more of the traditional stuff I just mentioned, but are built with a different philosophy in mind. And so the advocacy tools include things like Nation Builder, which you may have heard of. That's become very, very popular in Australia over the last couple of years. And is being used by all of the major political parties. It's being used by the Yes campaign and indeed, controversially, the No campaign around marriage equality. It's used by a lot of kind of NGOs as well. So, you know, people like ActionAid and I think Amnesty are using it at the moment as well. GetUp uses it for their field campaigns, which, you know, includes a blend of highly personal narrative information and conversations, as well as more scalable stuff. Another tool that's really showing a lot of promise at the moment is called Action Network, which is kind of built as an offshoot from the AFL-CIO in the US. So their peak union body, and is now being used by quite a lot of American unions, as well as their kind of, as you're probably aware, have a bit of a different progressive landscape to us. They have a lot more kind of mid-sized issue-based advocacy bodies. And so lots of those kind of organizations have picked it up. So for example, the Women's March that was held after Trump's inauguration was largely organized across Action Network. Then there's a third called Engaging Networks, which is very, very popular in the UK NGO scene. So indeed, Greenpeace is on Engaging Networks, a lot of those types. So I think Amnesty has historically used Engaging Networks quite a lot. I think International ActionAid is on it as well. I think Oxfam uses it too. And you can kind of see that a lot of these tools kind of emerge from and then carry a lot of the philosophies the places they've emerged from. So, you know, Engaging Networks, for example, is really, really well suited to large organizations that have a lot of technical support and a lot of resources to overcome things. But with that, you know, it's fairly sophisticated. The challenge there, though, is that it started to be built. Its original conception was probably about 10 years ago now, a bit more than that probably actually. And as a result, the foundations reflect the thinking of the time, which is still good. It's still perfectly usable, but that differs from Nation Builder, for example, who really kicked off about 5 years ago, and Action Network, which has really only kicked off in the last 2 or 3 years. And in each of these tools, you can see fundamentally different thinking about how to manage this sort of stuff. So yeah, engaging networks is a big lumbering bureaucracy with the benefits and pitfalls of such a thing. Nation Builder is kind of more of a mid-sized, fairly nimble organization, and the tool kind of reflects that, and hence why I think that's kind of found a real sweet spot in Australia. It really reflects a lot of the pace, attitude, and needs of a lot of Australian organisations. It does have a really strong electoral foundation, though, so lots of its stuff is about, which you don't necessarily have to need, but there's a lot of capacity for doing an electorate outreach campaign, of which a lot of our NGO clients just kind of treat that stuff as their membership or whatever their target group is, rather than thinking about it in an electoral term, even though that's what the tool kind of labels it as. And Action Network, which is, again, kind of reflects a much more recent turn in campaign thinking and a much more American style of approach, which has essentially means that each organization can create their own petitions or sell tickets to their own events, or have their own email lists, but you can also share that between each other and have ownership of the people who comes from that. So let's say that in this kind of speculative future, we might want to do a celebrate your CLC day, and every CLC around the country decides to have a morning tea and kind of promote that event and invite people from across the whole community to come together and have morning tea together. Action Network would allow each CLC to promote that on their own website, on their own channels, and to benefit from anyone that they got signing up. So let's say that you were promoting it in your local area, and you get 20 new people who you've never come across say, I'm curious to come by and see what you guys do. You'll then have a record of them, but then also you'll be able to kind of have a shared national list. So I understand there's probably a whole bunch of issues in how that might not necessarily work brilliantly with you guys, but you could potentially then start to create a national community legal centre advocacy organisation that kind of stands on top of all of the work that each individual is doing as well, which is kind of a really nice model for a lot of people, and you can kind of really benefit and build off of each other's work while also still having kind of clear ownership over what you are doing. And the Women's March was a really good example of that. Each state chapter, or like an organization or a group of people in each state really took ownership for promoting that and they managed all of the comms and all the people who they were able to meet and come across in their state, but they were able to also do that as part of a network and then create a much broader national movement out of that as well. So that's kind of neat. All of these systems, so the three I've just mentioned, as well as Salesforce and Razor's Edge, have kind of email capacity built into them. Some of them also have web hosting in them as well. So Nation Builder and Engaging Networks, both commonly, you'll host your website within those environments as well, which can actually end up saving you a bit of money too, because you pay one fee for both your CRM and your website, whereas the others, so Action Network, Salesforce, and Razor's Edge, kind of you have to have your own kind of separate website, and the CRMs plug into that. You can also connect Action Network and Salesforce together, and indeed a couple of the big organizations we're working with who need a dedicated membership list. So again, really thinking unions or traditional large volume revenue raising, so like donor-based NGOs are using that combination of Salesforce and Action Network. So Salesforce for their your fundraising outreach, donor management, and Action Network for their public communications and advocacy work as well. Yes, that's that. I just realized there's another comment, so I'll just have a quick look at that. Great, yeah, fantastic. Yeah, good. Definitely a good idea. Sorry, the question, the chat comment was, if you guys can't see it, is we do have a National Association of Community Legal Centres, the peak body, the NACLC, but I'll definitely pass this info on to them. That's great. I didn't want to, speak out of turn, so I was a bit cautious there, but yeah, glad to know. And hopefully that example is kind of illustrative and makes sense. You can even do that on like a smaller scale too. So for example, another really good example of that kind of network approach is if all of the consumer law centers from across the country decided to work together on a campaign on their sector, or if a couple of the regional centers decided to work together on a shared campaign, you'd be able to control your corner, but also have a clear pool that's focused. And like you could have a website where everyone can sign up, but then everyone gets kind of filtered down into their own little corner of the woods. Just so that's great. So I think so that's kind of the different styles of thing and how they fit together. When it comes to donations as well, all of these systems have payment gateways integrated into them, and that's really important because as some of you may well be aware, setting up payment gateways is a massively complicated process and a regulatorily fraught one, in that you need to meet a number of extremely strict kind of financial and security kind of conditions and regulations. So having a system that fully integrates that stuff and does that for you, I think is really important and really, really valuable. Most of them also allow you to use different payment processes, which means you can look at getting different kind of deals. I know that some of them also offer charity or NFP rates as well, which is really competitive and really ideal, particularly at low volume. Payment gateways, are also charged in volume as well as these kind of platforms generally as well. So if you're kind of small or reasonably sized, you can get away with something that's actually really good quality for not a particularly high cost. So I think that's a quick overview of the landscape. I'll take another quick pause, and I'd really like people to kind of share some of the problems they might be facing internally that they think a CRM might fix, but also especially what it would take for it to solve it. Is user adoption an issue? Like, for example, are people kind of stressed and poor on time and don't have time to learn a new thing? Are people spread really far apart? Do you have people working lots of part-time? So, would it be really helpful to help with handing over? But, what are the kind of issues that might factor into that? Slash, on a different note, I'd be really interested to know if you have any thoughts or questions about, the technology more broadly. Does it make sense? Are you hoping that it might do something or not do something? I'd be really interested to know if there's any other kind of thoughts, challenges, questions, or reflections on some of the stuff I've just mentioned. I also realized that we're actually only about a little bit over 10 minutes away from 1 or 12, depending on where you are. So yeah, I might open up the scope of those questions even more to anything else you might want to ask while we're here too. One other thing that occurs to me just while we're waiting for questions is there is another platform that kind of fits. I would say probably on the advocacy side, but definitely, as with all of these, kind of straddles that fence and touches on both. styles, which is Civi CRM, which some of you may have heard of. I've noticed that a number of, for example, disability charities, a lot of people who've been involved with the Greens in Australia, or some community organisations, including CLCs, have used or have thought about using. Great question on social media. I'll definitely touch on that in a second. So I have used Civi CRM, which I think is worth kind of reflecting on. Civi is, going back to some of the kind of fundamental questions I mentioned throughout this chat that I think are really important to reflect upon. Civi is open source, which is great. Like, that appeals to a lot of us for kind of political and ideological reasons. It means that you can kind of take it, build it, use it as your own, and it means you don't have to keep paying a subscription fee or anything like that as well. It definitely means you're not contributing money to people who you may not disagree with. I know that Telstra uses Salesforce, for example. But I think the downsides that come with that is that that's only true if you've got the scale to have a really strong and verbose technical team working on it, because it does require you to work on it and build it out yourself and to maintain it yourself. We've just generally seen that organizations have really struggled to do that. I don't want to totally rule it out, because I think it's capable of being a good tool. My threshold for being convinced that it's appropriate for, I would be surprised if it was appropriate for any CLC, given that I can't imagine there's a team of 3 to 5 technological people working on it at any given time in your org. So that exists as another one to kind of look at and consider, and it's something that you'll probably come across if you haven't already while doing research. But they're my kind of thoughts on that. Touching on the social media question that was just posted in the chat, that's also a really great one. So most of these services have social media integration, but at different levels and at different complexities. And that really comes back to the year it was built kind of point that I made earlier on, in that the platforms that have been made or were created in the last 5 years reflect a very different understanding to what the internet is and to what data is than the one we had 10 years ago. And I think that's really, really important. One thing that we see with that Nation Builder does exceptionally well, that Salesforce does exceptionally well, and that Razor's Edge is making really, really significant strides, improvements on, is that social media integration. So, for example, in Nation Builder is the most common, but also one of the best examples of that social media integration. So let's say that I myself go to a website, and I'm like, oh, I'm really interested in this issue. I'd like to get this fact sheet. I'll put my email in. You email me back the fact sheet, and I read it. Have a great time. You then have my contact details that I've just provided you and given you, and it's also important to note that every one of these, although we're talking about data, requires the user's consent and their contribution in almost every respect. In fact, the social media thing I'm about to tell you is the only instance in which anything's provided that's not directly provided by the person. But yeah, with the social media stuff, I've just put in my email and I've given you my details and I've gotten my fact sheet. But with that, if I've used my personal email address, which is the one that I use for Facebook and Twitter and LinkedIn and all of that sort of stuff, it will then be able to match me to those accounts, and it'll then bring in a whole bunch of additional information. So you'll be able to see, and I may actually, let me actually end on showing you this, because I think that's going to be really illustrative. It'll bring in my photo, it'll bring in my description, it'll show you a couple of other bits and bobs about me, and you could even go and potentially have a look if you wanted. So let me pull myself up. Okay, and now I will just show my main screen, which I think I can do by doing this. I think maybe I am wrong. Can people see my main screen now? I'll just pop this open in chat. Yeah, great. So I've hit the play button. So are people seeing that? Maybe we'll try the old hand technique that worked well before. Yep, you can see it. Great, brilliant. So what I'll do is I'll get rid of me because we don't need that multiple times over. Put this down here. Yeah, you can see over here my little bio in Nation Builder, although this looks very, very similar in every platform that you'd be using. And so you see my name, I popped it in there. You can leave a little comment. I leave a kind of sarcastic comment about myself every time I do this. And my photo. But you can also see other things here. So you can see that I'm emailable, I'm text or callable. You can see my clout score. Clout's a silly, stupid thing that isn't really worth the time of day, but it's an attempt to work out how influential you are on social media, but it's based on a bunch of wacko science. You can see my gender, my language, my phone number, my 2 email addresses, because it was able to basically tell that I was the same person when I signed up with both email addresses and consolidate me into one. You can see my kind of bio that it's pulled from Twitter, and you can see links to each of those profiles. So there's my Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and my website. You can also see the last contact or interaction that this person's had. Again, it's a bit confusing because I called myself because I only ever use this backend myself. But that would potentially say, like, oh, last contacted by Ben, and so you'd be able to keep track of who's speaking to who and why and how. Under here, you've got a variety of tags. So tags are different to the other information in that, my mobile number is or is not that number. My email address is or is not that email address. My date of birth is or is not what it is. Whereas tags, you can do multiple different things. They're kind of like stickers that you might put on fruit at a supermarket or something. You can have a variety of different stickers, but it is or is not what it is, if that makes sense. So you can have different touch points. So like whether or not we're a donor, whether or not I'm interested in a particular issue or style of campaign, in the sense that I may be really, really passionate about both state and federal affairs, or maybe I'm only interested in local government, who knows. But you can be multiple different variations of those things. Underneath here, you can kind of see a pathway, so see what stages I'm at. And again, these are all kind of mock tests, but let's say I was preparing an event. So you could say, oh, I've RSVP'd to the event. Someone's called me to follow up to make sure I'm going to come. And you could then see if I've attended, and then if I ended up doing a donation ask, completing a donation ask at the end. So it's a way of keeping track of where people are at and helping to kind of push people along the line. And you can also kind of see historical activity. So, different things that have happened at which point and over time, and leave little notes. So this is kind of an example of what it means to keep track. You say oh, we had a call, and he is having an issue with his, computer. And you can post that as a bit of a private note. Yeah, so just seeing your note there about a demo of another CRM, not particularly, sadly. So I could show you Action Network actually if I dig it up. Just for context, I don't really want to show a client's backend, which is primarily the ones that I have access to. So we do keep a Nation Builder sandbox just to kind of tinker and play with and revise, but the majority of the other ones, by virtue of their pricing models, don't allow us as a developer to have a sandbox, so we just work directly within the client account. But let me see if I can log into the Action Network. I won't dwell on it too much if I can't get in. But it's very, very similar. Just a little bit different. And again, thinking about this in while that load in the context of, as I said, this is an advocacy-focused one, but as you can see here, it has everything that you'd need to manage just internal functional outreach as well. It's not it's not like that's ruled off. And up here you can change your website, send out mass email blasts, or track your fundraising. Oh, okay, I don't know what that is, but sure. Fingers crossed that is correct. Yeah, great, that seems to have worked. So in here you can kind of see kind of a bit of an overview, a very different dashboard. And I'm not sure, again, if we've got too much in here, because we usually move it out to, out to the end point. But suffice to say, it's very similar. Yes, there's no contact information in this account. But yeah, very, very similar. I might see if I can just go to their front page, and maybe I'll have a screenshot and I can talk to that instead. But just while I'm doing that, I might show you the other part of this, which is all the different fields you can keep. And indeed, this is, again, not unique to Nation Builder. Most CRMs will allow you to keep these fields plus many more. No, that just takes me straight back there. Oh, here we go. Yeah, cool. So under here, you can kind of see some of the functions that include. So petition, events, ticketed events, forms, letter campaigns, fundraisers, files, groups of people. This is Action Network again, as you can see. Emails, ladders. So ladders is their equivalent of the pathway thing that we saw in Nation Builder. Reports and queries, activists. There's kind of more overview and information stuff. And then in details, you can see tags, questions, custom fields, custom targets, stuff like that. Tags function very similar to the way they do in Nation Builder as well. Questions and custom fields function very similar to custom fields, which I'll show you in Nation Builder in a sec. Email wrappers and page wrappers are essentially just like page designs. Because as I said earlier on, only engaging networks and Nation Builder have website hosting in the tool. So with tools like Action Network, you actually have to design a kind of separate skin that looks like your website that lives in the third-party tool. But yeah, in Nation Builder, you can kind of see some of the more nuanced information that that any CRM will keep. So you've got first name, last name, email. You can have a couple of different emails, as we all often do. Mobile number, home phone, work phone, best time to call. You can also keep records of whether or not they want to receive emails or receive text messages or whatever. Whether they're comfortable being called, best time to call, fax, primary address, employer, organization, and occupation. You can also see up here on the right-hand side some of the electoral stuff I was talking about. So, levels of support or inferred support, whether they're a volunteer or a fundraiser, their availability to come and help, whether or not they're deceased, which is really important as well. Gender, marital status, party affiliation, previous, inferred, media market, award. A lot of that stuff obviously isn't important to NGOs, but is for people who do electoral work. Ethnicity, religion, place of worship, date of birth. You can also see up here point people, which again is something that's actually unique to Nation Builder, but also perhaps not particularly useful for a lot of other people. You can set a point person, so that's the person who's like kind of personally responsible for that person. So in the Nation Builder philosophy, their original thinking was that you'd have an organizer who might look after your neighborhood. So like, let's say my job is to look after my neighborhood. So therefore every person who lives in the neighborhood that I do, I would be their point person. And therefore I would kind of be able to kind of easily keep track of what they're all doing and what they're up to and what I need to do. That kind of works in internal organizations from a staff management perspective a little bit, but that wasn't, it's kind of reverse engineering it. That wasn't the original thinking. And you can kind of do that to different extents with the idea of permissions in other platforms, but it's a neat little thing that they do. as it's Salesforce, and I'm going to see if I can see. I might just look at Google image search. That way we can find like a little view of what the interface looks like, just to kind of circle out this compare and contrast screenshot. Cool. So well, this looks fairly old, but you know, you can see, hopefully, actually, this is probably a bit too low resolution for you all, isn't it? Get a big one. There's a vaguely looking thing. Yeah. Yeah. I'll pop this out. Cool. So here, this is kind of an older version of it, but you can at least kind of hopefully see what we're talking about. You can also see that it's much, much more commercial than any of the things that we've just looked at, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but kind of does speak to the point I'd made around how, you know, there's some cheapness and definitely really high quality functionality, but with using Salesforce, you lose some of that understanding about what it is that people doing social justice work do. And you can see up at the top here, you've got kind of home, chatter, campaigns, leads, campaigns being kind of outreach things that you're doing, leads being people you've got that have kind of, and opportunities for that matter being kind of people who are coming in. You've kind of got to reverse engineer it a little bit to make it work for you. As I said, like if you go through that process, it's pretty verbose. And the other thing is you can retool a lot of this. Like I actually haven't seen a lot of these little nav items before in the projects that we've worked on. So it's highly customizable, which is a real benefit as well, but just an additional kind of step. So something that I'd factor in if you're going to use something like either Razor's Edge or Salesforce is that, you know, by virtue of them traditionally being used as big, weighty backbones to organizations, you know, they kind of need to be treated as such, and it's usually a bit of a process to get them up and running. So just to factor in a bit of time and probably a bit of resources, even if not necessarily on the tool itself, on kind of partners to help get it all set up and running smoothly, is something that I think is kind of pretty important for them. Whereas some of the advocacy tools are much easier to get up and running really quickly. Again, because the kind of philosophy driving them is much more reflective of, you know, basically the people who've created all of those tools have worked in organizations like ours before and created the tools as a response to them. Whereas Razor's Edge and Engaging Networks were kind of created by people who used to work in really big charities and decided to kind of make something to make that work easier. And Salesforce was created by people who used to work in, you know, enormous commercial organizations and wanted to make them work a little bit easier. Yeah. So mindful that we've kind of run a little bit over time. I hope that that's been really helpful. Does anyone have any questions on any of the stuff that I just reflected? Is there anything else you'd like me to show you just while I've got these little bits and bobs open? I'm happy to kind of like take a last round of comments, thoughts, questions, and then respond to them, and then we can finish off. Okay, great. All right. Well, just I'll start wrapping up a little bit and give also a little bit more time for anyone who might be finishing a message to do so. Yeah, I hopefully that's all been really useful. I know this is an area where people are starting to think a little bit more about, and I think an area where CLCs in particular could stand to benefit quite a lot. by virtue of both the service delivery side and the fundraising side, both of which I think are heavily supported by tools like this. If you did have any more specific questions or wanted to pose any questions about your organization particularly and the nuances there, like, feel more than free to reach out to me. I realize that actually, if you can see my contact details, they're now there in my profile that I'm showing. But yeah, so just daniel@principalco.com.au is probably the best way to reach me. And yeah, happy to have a more direct conversation as well. I know I've tried to be as conversational as we can, because I know how dull these things can be if it's just didactic. But you know, technology is nonetheless fairly limiting. So yeah, if you've got any questions, please feel free to flip them to me directly. Yeah, other than that, I hope this has been helpful. Yeah, I think that's probably where I'll leave it, unless there are any more questions coming through, but it doesn't look like that's the case. So.
All right,
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Daniel. That was really helpful. I think, you know, particularly beneficial to hear which ones you would recommend and which ones you wouldn't worry about people even bothering with. It is a bit of a minefield out there in terms of what is even around. So that's really great. And what I might do is, while you've been talking, I've just been looking up some of those CRMs. So I might just send an email out to everyone just with the basic website for each one, so you can investigate that further yourself if you like. And thank you also for providing the opportunity for people to email you or contact you by phone if they have any other questions when they have more time to think about it. So we might leave it there, and thanks everyone for your attention and for your participation. Cheers. See you later, everyone.
Awesome. Thank you.